Well, yes, perfect start. There we go. I guarantee I will make every mistake that Sagiv just said that he feels I avoid. I'm really honored to be giving this inaugural lecture in this series. I think it's a very important series. I'm also very daunted to be the first person giving a lecture in this series because it's a vast and complicated terrain, and I will not be able to do it justice today. But I'll do my best. So, creativity in the age of artificial intelligence. I wanted to, it's going to be hard for me to see, but I did want to get a vague sense of how many people here are really familiar with machine learning and AI and how many people aren't. I know it's going to be a mix, but I want to get a, who's quite familiar or reasonably familiar with machine learning and artificial intelligence? And who is not? Okay, so we're almost 50-50. Perfect. That's how I feel. I'm sort of 50-50 on this. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how I got interested in this and how it shapes my particular approach to the questions of creativity and AI. After doing a bunch of freelance programming jobs for an engineering company fresh out of high school in the late 1970s, I found myself at art school. I did not go there with the intention of mixing my interests in art and computers, but I quickly realized that a computer program was a way of laying out a set of possibilities, and that the artist in me was intrigued by the thought of creating possibilities as artworks. In fact, as intrigued with this idea of creating these sets of possibilities as I was in creating the artworks themselves. I began to create interactive artworks, systems of possibilities that would resolve into specific creations through the participation of the audience. I'm going to show you a brief clip of the first major work I did like that, called Very Nervous System. You'll see a much earlier version of me interacting. Okay. Now, because I realize it's probably not automatically clear, what's happening is a camera is looking at my body movement and translating those movements or impressions of those movements into sound in real time. So that was completely interactive. There was no pre-composed music. They were all algorithms that were observing me and making that music. And I have a lot that I could say about this piece, but I'm going to focus on one thing that I think is related to what I want to say in this talk. When engaged in a very intense feedback loop, and this feedback loop happened in under 1/30 of a second. And in fact, I discovered that we only understand what we're doing with our body in about 1/10 of a second. We're only consciously aware of our movements in about 1/10 of a second, that the system is responding to our movements before we're completely aware of the movements we've already made. This creates a very tight and intense relationship. So in this kind of very intense feedback loop involving mind, body, and computer system, the human and the machine blur or melt into each other. In this kind of relationship, we humans are not very good at recognizing the richness of our own contribution to the experience. People would experience the work and comment that the system was very intelligent because it had synchronized to their movements, not realizing it was actually their human intelligence that had unconsciously coordinated that synchronization. We interpret our experience constantly, but usually misunderstand and underestimate the importance of our own participation. So that's the one lesson I'm going to bring to you from Very Nervous System. While I was tempted at the time to try to make the system learn from its users, I realized that if the system could learn and adapt, it would make it much harder for me to see what was going on with the user. Although clearly interactive, VNS offered sorry, I'm jumping ahead there. So I was curious about adding an ability to adapt or learn from the experience it was having. But I thought it was so important for me to understand this strange interplay between the person and the system and what was going on in the person before I could begin to understand what then an adaptive system would be doing in relationship to it. So VNS offered a very interactive experience, but it was clearly offering a limited sense of musical possibilities. For the next major work I created, called The Giver of Names, it was an attempt to create a system of creative possibilities with a much, much larger expressive range. The Giver of Names looks at objects, in the sense, so does very nervous system. They look at things and they make sound about them. But the Giver of Names looks at objects and considers them and talks about them, combining computer vision, association, and language generation. So we have a bunch of objects on the floor and a pedestal, and anyone coming into the gallery can pick up whatever they want and build a little still life on top of the pedestal. As soon as the objects are still, the computer grabs an image, and you see what the computer is seeing in the projection above. It attempts to isolate edges, to determine the real color of the objects, try to understand the shape a bit. We'll watch it go through the process here. So it's finding the edges. It's trying to isolate colors, the pure color. It's trying to get rid of shadows and reflections so it can simplify the shape of the image. Those who are familiar with current computer vision will find this laughably simplistic. But so it's looking at outlines, and and then it's using these impressions to fabricate a sentence.
To that devotion, the steadfastly orange yellow bomb flogged this syphilitic roundy plenitude.
There are times when that was one of the highlights of Giver of Names. It also had a tendency to be unbelievably stupid when important curators would walk into the room. So to make this work, I intentionally dressed myself up in the drag of an artificial intelligence researcher. I'd read about Conan's self-organizing feature maps and Rumelhart and McClellan's ideas about spreading activation and played with early neural nets. And I wanted to understand how one would go about making a thinking machine. I was not actually seeking to create such a machine, but to engage in the question in practice, to understand what it actually felt like to ask these questions and try to solve them. I was also trying to understand how a binary digital system might be engineered to hold and indeed embrace ambiguity. When the Giver of Names visually digests the objects and makes associations based on those inputs, its complex internal state shifts. It expresses this, and I use quotations here, state of mind in language, but the words it speaks are just a shadow, a silhouette of a much richer internal response to what it sees, full of possibilities and uncertainties. And I realized that the longer it held its impressions in an indeterminate state, the richer and more robust its observations were. I did not actually use neural networks in the Giver of Names, but the work was very inspired by what I saw as the potential of these systems. 20 years after I left the Giver of Names definitively unfinished, to steal Marcel Duchamp's wonderful term, people can run very advanced Giver of Names-like things on their smartphones. Creating the Giver of Names helped me understand things about myself as a human being that I'm not sure I would have discovered in any other way. Not because I succeeded in replicating myself, but because the ways I failed to replicate myself taught me a lot about what was hidden from me because I'm blinded by familiarity. I began to think of the computer as a prosthetic organ of philosophy, a tool through which I could practically and experientially pose thorny philosophical questions and play inside them. So I come to the question of creativity and AI with these experiences firmly in mind. Now, this is the part I'm most nervous about, because some of you know this terrain very well and some of you don't know it at all, and I'm trying to navigate the space in between. I'm going to say some things that will confuse some of you. I'll say some things that will infuriate others because you'll know that I haven't used precisely the right word, and I apologize in advance to both of you, both groups of you. And for those who do know neural nets, bear with me. This is going to be a very short introduction, but I think it's necessary for those who are not familiar with the terrain to have some way of understanding the things I'm going to say. So, neural networks are to some degree inspired by ideas of how the brain works. Brains are collections of perhaps 100 billion neurons interconnected into networks. Input from our senses, for example, flow through the networks of the brain to be transformed into memories, recognitions, actions, etc. And we learn by changing the way that stimulus is passed through the network. So to make this more tangible, we're going to use this wonderful tool called TensorFlow Playground. And I've actually recorded this in advance because I've had the experience of trying to do this live and not having it work out so well. TensorFlow Playground is a place you can go online to play with and watch a neural net actually learning. And we'll look at just some of the basic features of a neural net so that you'll have some grasp of what's going on. We have here, in the classic neural net scenario, we have an objective. In this case, the idea is to determine the color of a data point based on its position. So we want to be able to predict, if we know where on the space a dot is, what color it should be. And then we have a data set, which is the set of those points or this is actually the training set, the orange and blue points. We're gonna look at those and learn from those to try to be able to then make judgments on other points we haven't seen before. Now we have an input into the network, and the input in this case is just the x or horizontal position and the vertical position of any particular dot in the space over there. We have what are called the hidden layers and their connections. This is where all the mysterious learning takes place. But you can see they're all connected with lines that allow information to flow from layer to layer to layer, and they end up at outputs, which are going to make the actual estimation of color. And now we can, let me just find my mouse here. This will happen a little too fast to watch, so I'm going to go back through it once it's happened. But probably you want to look at the far screen to see what it's doing first. It's slowly getting to the point where, in terms of the color of the background, you can see that it's defined the space into areas where it would expect the blue dots and area to expect orange dots. And I think, let me see if I can do this. Just have to find out how my mouse can get over there. It doesn't really matter. Fair enough. Okay. I was going to try to stroll through it more slowly so you can see that each of these inner neurons were changing slowly. What was happening was each one of these positions of the dots in the training set were being input. The output was saying, we know already that's a blue dot, and the middle was adjusting itself to try to make that association. And sometimes, for those who are really unfamiliar with this, I sometimes think about a jar full of jelly beans that haven't settled. And in some way, the learning process, this is a very rough analogy, but if you shake it and it compresses down, there's a little bit of that kind of thing happening, although for those of you who know about AI, know it's probably happening in 100,000 dimensions or something, instead of 2 or 1. Okay, so that is your brief lesson in machine learning. Now, one of the things that we can do with this sort of system to make it more concrete is we can teach it to recognize objects. In this case, instead of inputting the position of dots and telling it, or trying to guess what it is, we're going to input images, and we're going to guess what the images are. And you train a system like this by giving it millions of images and telling it what each of those images are, so they have to be labeled in advance. And slowly, the inner layers come to a point where they essentially connect up in the right way to get the right result. It's a very mysterious process the first time you see it, but contemporary neural nets are able to recognize images with at least the percentage accuracy as humans are right now. Okay, so inside the neural net, we can peek in. I'm going to go back to my text here because it's going to tell me what's going on here. Okay. Yes, so there are 3 things I wanted to talk about more conceptually about the neural nets before I get to this image. There are a couple of things, or a few things that I find really interesting about what a neural net is doing. The first is something called distributed representation. Even though the network outputs the right answer, the catness of the image, maybe we'll go back to that, the catness of the image is not in the form of an internal image of one or more cats. The determination of catness is the result of a collection of many separate impressions that build collectively to the final decision. When we communicate with each other about cats, we share pictures of specific cats or use the word cat. The word cat is a culturally agreed upon shortcut to a much more distributed set of impressions that define our experience of a cat. Secondly, ambiguity and robustness. Each level of the neural network contributes to the final decision, but the neural net maintains a richly ambiguous state until the last moment, allowing for dogness or foxness to coexist with catness as long as possible, so that it's ready to be swayed in a different direction as the image is further digested. And this is something that also goes in our visual processing systems and why we're able to actually perform the things that we can. Now, a fascinating thing happens when we reverse an image classifier. Instead of taking in images and determining the correct names or labels, the labels can be sent backwards through the network to create images. In fact, we can ask any interior neuron in the hidden layers to do the same thing. That shows us what that particular neuron is responding to. So, whoops. So if we think about there being multiple layers starting at the bottom near input, the lowest levels of a neural network that's classifying images will look for simple things like lines and edges. As we go to higher levels, we start to get other sorts of features like curves and textures. And you can see on the right-hand side the kinds of things in images that would trigger those neurons in the image. As we go higher, we start to get things like wheels and honeycomb patterns and things like that. And as we go deeper and deeper, we start to recognize things like eyes and dogs' faces and flowers. So one of the fascinating things about this is how it relates to things that I've always been interested in about how we see. As humans, we are not just looking, we're usually looking for. And this active aspect of our visual perception means that we are just as often projecting onto what we look at as taking in the raw visual information. McLuhan had a great flip on the classic cliche when he said, "I will see it when I believe it." And that's very much something that's happening. There's a lot of fiction going on as we construct our image of the world as we look out into it. And it was a really interesting experiment that Morvan said Alla and Tika did at Google Brain was to really push this to an extreme and essentially have the machine project to the degree that it was hallucinating. Most of you have seen these sorts of images. I apologize, I'll go through them very quickly, but I really want to show enough of them to show what a range this sort of system range of images this sort of system can express. Now, first, I'm going to show you, all these things I'm going to show you are based on hallucinations, essentially. Again, I use the term somewhat carefully. Hallucinating into random noise. So it's supplied with random noise to begin with, and then it slowly interprets this, essentially feeds back on itself. So it says, oh, that part looks a little bit like a dog. And then it says, it makes it more dog-like. And then it says, oh, no, that's more like a dog. It feeds back on itself until the image becomes clear. And we can see that happening in this image here. Although it's not a dog that's coming out, it's something stranger. So it's slowly working at different scales, in fact, for those who know what's going on here, building more and more levels, building up structure that is somehow inherently inside the network that's been trained on images. And the projector is a little weird. That's why it's so washed out there. There's a little more detail than that, but that's fine. Now, the completely astonishing thing about this is that the network trained to classify images can generate such a rich tapestry of output images. This rich field of possibilities is commonly referred to as the latent space. And I will be referring to this term a lot as we go along. Now, when we go through, I'm going to go through a bunch of examples of things you can find by poking inside this particular neural network, trained neural network, and asking it to generate images. So at the lower levels, you get basic textures. A couple levels up, you start to get more complex textures. And then you start to get form and structure. And then you start to see things that start to resemble things you recognize. Going a little higher again. And then you see things, I think this is basically hands and flesh. Birds of some sort. I think fruit cocktails, I'm not sure. Babies in bassinets. Balls of all sorts. Bicycle wheels. Autumnal landscape. Flowers, and some distorted version of the afternoon of the swimming pool. Around the world in 80 days. Chairs. And then you start to have emergences of things that are trying to be symbols, or trying to look like text, or labels on products. You get architecture and structure. And at the top, you start to get mixtures of just about everything. So that is an exploration of the broadest, in the broadest sense, of the latent space of that neural network. Now, we can't help but see these images and wonder, isn't this art? Isn't this just the essence of creativity? Isn't this the essence of creativity? Or at least puzzle about what creativity actually is. What is certain is that these results were made possible by some extremely creative thinking on the parts of the many researchers, thinkers, and artists who contributed to the creation and particular use of the neural network that generated these images. Another breakthrough in image generation was discovered by the researcher Ian Goodfellow. He came up with the idea of a generative adversarial network, or GAN. In essence, a GAN is made up of two networks. One is the artist, one is the critic. The artist keeps generating images, the critic keeps assessing them. The artist, seeking to please the critic, keeps adjusting his style until, after millions of test images, the critic is relatively satisfied. Recently, NVIDIA research unveiled StyleGAN, a GAN that has learned to generate human faces with remarkable realism. It's done this by seeing many millions of images of people's faces and learned based on that. Oh, how did we miss? Oh, yes, okay. So there is I'm going to skip that slide. It's going to be implicit all the way through. Okay, so here's some examples of the output of StyleGAN from NVIDIA research. And this is one part of one slice through the latent space of StyleGAN. And we see there's actually an infinite gradation of possible faces between the young woman in the bottom and the older gentleman in the top, and it can just infinitely make up more and more of those. And we have, interestingly enough, at the third row at the far edge and the first row in the far in this corner, there's a kind of what StyleGAN is determined as approximately the average or general neutral image of a person. Oops, wrong direction. There we go. Okay, here's another set. I kept coming to that. Okay, another set. And here's an example where we go beyond the normal edges of the latent space, and we see that the images degrade, become quite wild and crazy, and then degrade to points where they're meaningless. That slide is in there about 5 times for some reason. Okay, so that's interesting, although I must say that there's a strange mixture of emotions I have as I start to see these images that are becoming so realistic. There was something very charming about the flawed nature of earlier GANs, and the new ones are getting almost too good at replicating the look of the human face, and somehow loses maybe some of its expressiveness, but it's nonetheless a very exciting result. And one of the things that has been done with this is to reverse it and to look for yourself inside StyleGAN. The artist Mario Kleeman actually went and looked for Mona Lisa, and he found this version of Mona Lisa inside StyleGAN. So in the latent space of StyleGAN, this image can be found. And in fact, because of the nature of latent space, often if you move one direction or the other across latent space, you get a very particular shift. He found that he can make a sort of Mona Lisa smile or look quite perturbed. So it's interesting that a network trained only on natural photographs of faces will actually have it within itself to produce that image. That's rather extraordinary, I think. I also, being a closet narcissist, had to look for myself. And it did a frighteningly good job, although I don't know. And when it gives me the smile or the frown, I start to get very alarmed by when it's running there and wonder about myself. Okay, the next thing I'm going to show is something that a lot of you will also be familiar with. It's something called style transfer. In this case, this is something called style transfer, originally formulated by Gaddis, Ecker, and Bethke at the University of Tübingen. Style transfer is a process by which the style and texture of one image is applied to the content of another. And here is a wonderful exploration by a really great artist using neural networks, Gene Kogan, who's also a wonderful researcher in the area of machine learning for arts. And he has taken the animation of Alice in Wonderland and reinterpreted it in terms of a few artists. And I guess there's no sound this time, that's fine. I find the solo one particularly shocking in the way that it actually modifies the form to suit the style in a sense. So, that's kind of crazy. Okay. So now similar approaches can be applied to other media such as text or music. There are wonderful examples using text. I haven't done any of them because I was worried they would like to read them and for you to get an impression of them would take too long. But I'll give an example from music. OpenAI recently unveiled MuseNet. Here's a sample of music it improvised based on the first few notes of Mozart's Ronda alla Turca in the style of Chopin. Ran out of inspiration there, I guess. It is hard, here's the time for this slide. It is hard, especially as an artist, writer, or composer, not to be confused, indeed alarmed, about what this means for human creative production and the value of human creativity. We find ourselves in a situation somewhat like that of painters at the dawn of photography. In his essay, Can Computers Create Art?, Aaron Hertzman notes, in today's world, we are so swamped with images that it's hard to imagine just how special and unique it must have felt to see a skillfully executed realistic painting. The technical skills of realism were inseparable from the other creative aspects of the activity of painting, I assume. This changed when photography automated the task of producing images in the real world. Ultimately, being relieved of the responsibility of faithfully representing the world, the artists of the early 20th century reimagined what art could be. Artists of the 21st century are facing a similar situation and challenge. So AI is going to change art making and creative practice in general. One of the ways it's going to do it is going to be wonderful because it's going to simplify a bunch of menial tasks that we've had to do for many, many, many years. Here's an example of fixing up a portrait. So by blocking out areas, it's asking the neural network to hallucinate or imagine what a younger version of the person will be. Now I'm going to play this whole thing through because at some point the user covers an eye and you'll see that it suddenly fails rather remarkably to do this in an appropriate way. Here we go. Watch the eye that comes up. So it's amazing, but it's got a few interesting challenges. Another thing that I personally have found very useful in the last week is something called super resolution, because I just sold a piece of art to a collector in Vancouver, and they needed it bigger. And I couldn't make it bigger, not really. The image made big looks like this. This is a very small part of it. But using a piece of AR software, I was able to translate it into this, which feels like a miracle. It's imagining what the network is coming up with plausible, higher resolution replacements for where those blocks of pixels are. And it's actually very, sometimes astonishing how well it does. Sometimes it fails hilariously, but in this case, it did a magnificent job. Another thing that I've been using AI very practically for is for tracking things. I've done a lot of work in my life where I track things through time and create videos more interactive experiences showing these patterns of things across time. When I was in Japan last year, I took video of Shibuya Crossing, the busiest pedestrian crossing in the world, and using OpenPose AI software from Carnegie Mellon, it actually took 2 months for the computer to figure all this out, but allowing me now to do something I've dreamed of a long time, which is to compose a kind of symphony of surveillance symphony of a public space. I don't know if it's going to be musical. I use the term symphony a little bit loosely here, but using these dots in some way, these pieces of information to create something new from that. So I benefited greatly from those pieces of AI. Now, more interesting to me is artists using AI as an artistic medium itself. Let me recover my place in my text here. I'm used to speaking off the cuff, but trying to keep this from becoming a 2-hour lecture. I've written it down, and I don't want to fall off the edge here. Right, so before I show you examples of what artists are creating with AI, I want to dwell a little longer on the creativity involved in the actual research behind the systems. As I mentioned at the start of the talk, I feel strongly that strongly about the act of creating possibilities. It takes a special kind of creativity to grasp the potential of research directions and to pose fruitful questions that lead the research forward. Now, the very richness of the products of AI research make them daunting tools or media to use as an artist. To quote Kyle MacDonald, one of the foremost artists working with AI, one of the biggest challenges for anyone working with machine learning as a creative tool is producing output that's more compelling than the demo. Some artists, and I can tell you this is absolutely true, I feel kind of frozen sometimes in the face of what the sample code is able to do. Some artists approach the challenge of creating their own handcrafted training sets to create more idiosyncratic AI systems, or they invent new ways to explore the latent space of the network. And I'm going to show you some examples now. So this first one is a piece called Neural Face by self-described neurographer, instead of photographer, Mario Klingemann. And for this piece, he trained a network on music clips of 60s French pop icon Françoise Hardy. Each frame was labeled with face markers indicating the head position and facial expression, so to find where the nose and the eyes are and the mouth, etc. Through the learning process, this built up a latent space of possible images of the singer, and then he then used new face markers to navigate through this latent space. So we just have to think of latent space as this vast territory, and you can wander in various ways this latent space, and each position will generate a new image. And by changing the kind of input you're giving, or the input you're putting backwards through the system in a sense, you're moving to different ones. So you're navigating through this space. So this is Neural Face. When I first saw this work, I wrote to Mario, I am haunted by the sense of constructed presence, the play of fluctuation and constancy, the sense of conjured personhood, of a persistent and coherent character suspended delicately in a network of contingencies. I find it very strange to sense in these very different and fluctuating images a strange sense of the presence of the person that all of those images were taken of, and I find it uncanny in a different way than you might find other kinds of things uncanny, or that I find them uncanny. So he used the same thing for another piece called an alternative face, which he pushes in a more political direction, using the same system, but navigating with face markers derived from Kellyanne Conway's famous TV appearance when she coins the term alternative facts.
Of office. That's just flat out false. And
it was corrected immediately.
Chuck, why was it said? Chuck, why was it said in the first place? Because everybody's so presumptively negative.
Climb into the head of that
no,
reporter.
that it's okay. No, excuse me. Oh, no. That reporter was writing on behalf of the press pool. That falsehood got spread 3,000 times before it was corrected.
Excuse
and
me.
It's still out there.
It does not excuse, and you did not answer the question.
I did answer your question.
No, you did not. You did
Yes,
not answer the question of why the president...
find it strangely disturbing how Kellyanne Conway seems to really inhabit that face. Like, it stops being Francois Hardy. It's very strange. So Memo Akten has created a wonderful series of works called Learning to See. In this particular example, he has trained the GAN network on seascapes and then points a camera at his desk and stimulates the network with a bunch of objects he is physically manipulating, inducing the network to create uncanny seascapes that look real at any moment but move in very unwatery ways. He literally gets his hands into the guts of the latent space and manipulates it directly. He also wears great nail polish.
Sadly, one Sunday, I waited and waited with flowers in my arms for the dream I'd created. I waited till dreams like my heart were all broken, the flowers were all dead, and the words were unspoken. The grief that I knew was beyond all consoling.
Do I ever want to play with this piece? I want to get my hands in there.
Of my heart was a bell that was tolling.
Artist Helena Sarin builds her data sets out of her own photographs, paintings, and drawings. She often makes collages out of the resulting images, especially where the texture or color appeals to her, but the image's content is weak. As a result, her work has a look that's quite distinct from most other work made with GANs. And there's another example. And then for Mosaic Virus, artist Anna Riddler took 10,000 photographs of tulips over tulip season and used them as her training set for her network. This work plays on the relationship between tulip mania in Holland in the 1630s and the modern mania for cryptocurrencies. I started here. The amount of intensity of the much valued stripes caused by the Mosaic virus at blooming tulips depends on the moment-to-moment value of Bitcoin. She also presents the entire labeled training set as an installation in itself called Myriad Tulips to represent the hidden labor of dataset collection upon which most machine learning depends. It's hard to imagine how many hours of time graduate students in various institutions around the world have spent labeling and collecting data to enable machine learning systems to do what they're doing now. And so it's really interesting. I think it's an interesting intervention to present that work as labor in that sense. The recent arrival, oh, that's an even further out image. The recent arrival of Big GAN, every GAN has to have a nickname, Big GAN, which requires more hardware than most artists have at their disposal, led Mario Klingemann to adopt the persona of a navigator or explorer curator instead of someone using his own data sets. And he tweeted out his discoveries with wry and cryptic captions over Twitter as he traversed the waste latent spaces of Big GAN. So the first one I saw was just called "You're Late." So found by Mario Klingemann, but based on Big GAN created by these researchers. Then found a hideaway in the wastelands of Big GAN. What dangers and wonders will wait for me on this island? Will I find food, water, and shelter? And where the hell did that cape suddenly come from? Being confined to my quarters, so these are all images that are found in the latent space of Big GAN, et cetera, et cetera. I won't read the whole thing. But behind this, we have this remarkable hidden mechanism. And it was a real fascinating pleasure to be following along with Twitter as Mario explored Big GAN and experiencing it more like a travel log or something. And it was almost as though he invented a new kind of form, the GAN travel log or the latent space travel reportage or something like that. Taking another approach to this challenge, Joel Simon took a different approach to the richness of Big GAN, creating something called GAN Breeder. Let's see if we can get it. Whoops, okay, do I have to click there? Okay, here we go. We'll see if it comes up. Now, there we go. Okay, so in GAN Breeder, it's a website that creates a community of big GAN explorers, selecting images they liked, crossbreeding them, and sharing them. So you can select an image here, and then it gives you a few variations. And you can say, oh, I like that one. Yeah, this one's going in a nice dark relationship direction. And then you can start to modify your path through Big GAN. And it's actually, there's a huge collection of images you can look through that have been just sort of noted. I saw this, I saw this. It's another approach to the multiplicity of images that this sort of system can create. What does it mean to create images when you can generate at least interesting images constantly? It poses an interesting challenge. And so designing a new way to move through them or a way to experience them is an interesting alternative. Okay. So, in response to the generative fecundity of Big GAN, perhaps we should leave the image making to the machines. We will be seekers, curators, critics, collectors, and consumers. This raises an interesting question. What is the value of making? Does it matter how and by what a work of art is made? Is the intention with which it was made what makes it art? Or can the intentional act of drawing special attention to something that already exists make it art? This is a century-old question ushered in after the arrival of photography. Marcel Duchamp selected certain manufactured items and gave them titles, calling them ready-mades. So it really is true that photography kicked off some of the questions that I think neural networks are really posing for artists. Other artists have looked to, I'm going to get back to my thing here, hold on. There we go, okay. So, other artists have looked to machine learning systems as creativity enhancers, foils, adversaries, or critics. Quoting from Memo Acton's website about the work I'm going to show you next, over the course of a year, Irish vocalist and composer Jennifer Walsh engaged in a daily ritual of performing solo improvisations in front of her webcam. Collecting the hours of footage at the other end, computational artist Acton used the video and audio material to create and train a machine learning-driven system that can mimic the key components of Walsh's identity, her voice and her face. During the performance, the video and audio output from the machine are neither recordings nor processed. Every frame and sound is generated live in real time, navigating the hypersphere, constructed from the fragments of memories in the depths of the neural networks. The original and virtual Walsh inhabit the uncanny valley together, singing in duet, improvising, listening, and responding to each other. Can you have a little more volume? Here the system reflects the performer back to herself as a foil to improvise with. This synthetic performer can draw unexpected possibilities from the latent space generated by her own daily improvisations to challenge the performer in new ways. Similarly, British choreographer Wayne McGregor has developed a similar system with Google Arts and Culture for his choreography.
Fascinated in how AI might actually develop the conversation around what is choreography, who has to make choreography, what are the potentials of choreography.
We use the archive from Wayne to train the algorithm so they can use this data to generate movement.
When I'm working with dancers normally, what I'm asking them to do through their own creativity is make iterative versions of an idea that I might have proposed. What this tool does for each little moment is do 400,000 iterations of that. Yeah, so the canvas is way, way bigger. We had to gift the archive, and it was a huge archive, you know, it's thousands of hours of video to be analysed. What this tool allows us to do is go, okay, I'm starting with this phrase. I would like the machine learning tool, the AI, to invent the next phrase, but in the style of Jordan, or in the style of Jess. And then you can get combinations of those. And then it's learning all the time and feeding back. And so this iterative version gives you all of these new possibilities you couldn't have imagined. Because I think part of the experience of creating something with the use of AI and an AI form that makes a novel dance that's never been danced before is that actually you see that working in a kind of a collaborative environment. And so I'd love to see that on stage.
I can imagine the AI in this case being the critic, knowing an artist's creative output so well that it can push that artist to new realms of creative exploration. Again, with the artist as the generator, pushing the artist or performer to works or performances they would never achieve. Finally, I want to look a little more closely at the questions of creativity, the creativity of machine learning systems themselves. As I have learned after the past 4 decades, to be wary of making definitive statements about the future of technology and its place in our culture. So instead, I will offer some very subjective impressions. Firstly, I must admit that I have a fairly romantic notion of creativity and art making from my own experience. The idea of the giver of names occurred to me seemingly of a piece, including title, all of a sudden, on a flight back from Amsterdam in 1991, from within the fogs of exhaustion, jet lag, and a severe hangover, under the mounting pressures of the question of what on earth to do after a very nervous system. While in our passionate pursuit of an objective, we hit a seemingly insurmountable wall, we sometimes find ways to completely reframe the problem, find a solution from a completely different domain, or reimagine our goal. Is this state of frustration an important component of creativity, or is it rather a sign that I'm not really that well adjusted or designed for creativity? It's certain that I have not seen any computers attain that particular state of frustration, and that makes me just wonder what this means for the creativity of machines. On the other hand, in contrast to the stormy birth of the giver of names, I sometimes find inspiration for projects in a state of meditative emptiness and openness, where I let go of having any particular goal and let the content or context or problem speak to me. Kevin O. Stanley, senior research scientist at Uber AI Labs, has observed that most machine learning development is designed around systems that have very clear objectives, and that this is an impediment to real creativity in AI. Despite this objection, AI systems often find completely unexpected solutions to problems, and that these solutions seem extremely creative. In 1994, in really a groundbreaking piece of work, Carl Sims created an evolutionary context where simple 3D virtual creatures made up of connected blocks and simple neural networks would attempt to learn to move across their virtual landscape. To quote from the wonderful paper, which I highly recommend you look up, The Surprising Creativity of Digital Evolution. This is a quote. Instead of inventing clever limbs or snake-like motions that would push them along, as he hoped for, the creatures evolved to become tall and rigid. When simulated, they would fall over, harnessing their initial potential energy to achieve high velocity. Some even performed somersaults to extend their horizontal velocity. He just said, you know, move from here to here. And so they turned themselves into something that would just fall and actually have, oh, let's see, here we go. I have video of this creature performing its remarkable feats of locomotion. It would never occur to us to solve the problem in that way. And so this is the kind of surprising solution that often comes out of such a system. In this case, the sense of creativity of the solution exists only in our minds. The system came to what we consider a novel solution simply by being unencumbered by our human expectations and assumptions about locomotion. But Stanley has been exploring AI systems that search for novelty instead of seeking a particular objective as a way to make AI more creative. And this approach intrigues the artist in me. Oh, and you won't get to see this image, which is fine. Last October, this non-existent portrait produced by artificial intelligence, Edmond de Bellamy, de la Famille de Bellamy, was sold at Christie's Fine Art Auction for $435,000. This work is a remarkably bad example of the output of a GAN, made by a group of artists who called themselves Obvious using open source codes they downloaded from the internet. The work is signed in the lower corner with the basic equation that defines the function, that generally defines the function of a GAN. It is a terrible example of the creative potentials of AI. Its only supportable claim to being art is as a provocation designed in part to outrage. But provoking outrage has had a long and venerable place in the history of art. And of course, Duchamp presented the urinal back in 1913 to similar outrage. So I realize I'm of two minds about, and I wish I had the picture, in fact, to show you how bad it is. It's really just, it's really an awful thing, but it does at least put the question in the largest possible sort of venue in the art world about asking the question whether computers or neural networks are creating art or not. So it's interesting from that perspective. Does it matter how and by who or what an artwork is made? Does the value of an artwork reside in the artist's act of creation or in the audience's act of appreciation? In my exploration of interactive art in the 1980s, I was explicitly including the audience's act of appreciation into the work itself. It is clear to me that the audience for any work of art contributes greatly to the value of the work by bringing a lifetime of experiences, opinions, and desire to the table. But I still feel very ambivalent about the status of deep dream images that are presented earlier, or the output of Big GAN. And my feelings about those Big GAN images changed when I saw them framed by Mario Klingemann as images in a sort of travel journal. In his book, The Most Human Human, What Talking with Computers Teaches Us About What It Means to Be Alive, Brian Christian says, "To be human is to be a human, a specific person with a life history and an idiosyncrasy and point of view. Artificial intelligence suggests that the line between intelligent machines, and people blurs most when a puree is made of that identity." Referring, I guess, to the fact that there's a sort of statistical process going on, so the puree is the reduction of those idiosyncrasies into a mean or a mush. It was drilled into me at art school that art exists where the universal meets the particular. Most AI outputs still feel very universal to me, lacking that connection to the particular, although I think that the interventions of the artists I've presented bring the particular and the idiosyncratic back into the mix. So in summary, and I had spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to write the summary, and it's not sufficient and it's not satisfactory, but it's very much a reflection of my current state of confusion about this question. Although inspired by the workings of our own brains, I would argue that AI research has discovered other, truly alien ways of learning that are complementary to ours. Although we cannot resist the temptation to put humans and AI machines in competition, I think we should focus more attention on exploring these complementary abilities. AI offers exceptional patience, exhaustiveness, rigor, and the unique perspectives that are a product of its exquisitely refined and articulate naivete. And importantly, these unique perspectives can be expressed in a form that is coherent to us. We can make some sort of sense out of those images from Big GAN. It tempts us to make sense at least, so there's some expressiveness happening there. Along with our own intelligence, we bring to the table curiosity, passion, surprise, hope, expectation, desire, and the frustration that comes with it to the table. Making the most of the ways we complement each other is not a simple or straightforward task. It is one that will require an enormous effort of collaboration across very divergent disciplines. It is not simply a matter of improving the user experience, making AI user-friendly. It is a task of finding ways to articulate across disciplinary boundaries what is unique and extraordinary about humans and what is unique and extraordinary about these systems. I think that the way forward is best reflected in the experiments that artists are undertaking with machine learning, embracing curiosity and enthusiasm in equal measure with critical thinking. And that's it. Thanks. I love questions, and I love stupid questions, especially because smart questions get answers out of me I already expect. dumb questions get new ones. So please feel comfortable asking.
I have a question. It might be smart, it might be stupid, I don't know, but you talked a lot about authorship, and it occurs to me there was that case a year or two ago about the monkey who took the selfie, and the photographer got sued by somebody who was advocating for the monkey who actually owned the copyright. So if AI is the monkey taking or making the pictures, who owns the copyright?
Yes, so I think there's a particularly interesting variation of that question. And that has to do with the copyright status of the latent space itself. So a latent space is built out of many thousands or millions of images from various contexts. Or, for example, in some of Mario Klingemann's work, he's using paintings from the 17th century or something. So there is authorship in the things that created the latent space. But anything that comes out of the latent space is not a direct copy. So is there, imagine some sort of a future neural net system trained on all the Disney films that's putting out Disney films somehow derived from the latent space, right? What is the copyright position of those? Which I think is an even more complicated question than the one you posed. The copyright question has been troubling interactive art from a long time ago. I used to get strange papers from law faculty of various universities, especially in the United States, trying to determine the copyright status of music that Very Nervous System would make when members of the public were moving through it, or musicians. What if a famous musician moves through Very Nervous System, right? So I think this question is not going to go away, but it's becoming more and more interesting and challenging. So I don't really have an answer for you, but maybe another example.
One way that we see AI in the news a lot today is usually like words of warning with reiterating patterns of like police profiling and like reaffirming racial biases, or if you look at Facebook and a high degree of that error being associated in facial recognition having like noise for people of color. Like, what are some ways that you've seen artists cope with the problems of reaffirming? Like, what are some problems that you'd be concerned with artists reaffirming over time?
So that's a really interesting question, and I didn't address this topic at all today, because I was talking about creativity, but the last lecture about AI I gave, I specifically talked about that in the context of not face recognition, but also facial expression detection using AIs. And I used a fascinating example. I'm going to not be able to remember her name. There's a researcher out of MIT, Joy, and I don't remember her last name, who was alarmed by the fact that AI systems were not recognizing her face as a valid face. She's African American. They weren't recognizing her face as an actual face, and so she is pushing hard to make sure that sort of bias doesn't appear in machine learning systems. At the same time, there's a black rights activist in the States who is arguing that the black community does not want facial recognition to get better at identifying black faces, because that's not likely to be to the advantage of the African American community. Even though it means they're excluded from certain things, it also means that there would be, if it was very efficient, it would be more efficient at targeting them. So I thought that was a really interesting set of different attitudes about that very tricky question. To address the question of bias in data sets is quite a large question, but it's a really interesting one. I think for those who don't know this territory, one way to understand it is that when you train a neural network, it does an incredibly good job of copying all the relationships that are expressed, or most of the relationships that are expressed in that data set. And if that data set is from the 60s, it will carry with it attitudes, potentially, certain biases about things that are a part of the life of the 60s. There will be fewer black women, will all be a certain, it embeds attitudes from the data set very precisely. So you can make a very precisely racist database, if you want, or a neural net, if you want, in that way. And it's a very difficult question how to properly come up with some sort of way of balancing this out. It's I think, a very important area of researching the ethical side of the question of the use of neural networks. There are other examples. I wish I could show images of them, of artists addressing this question, but certainly an area of great interest. I wish I could show you Joy's stuff because she's very animated in talking about her particular angle and the work that she's done around that. Yes, Richard.
Oh, and just for the researcher, it's Joy Buolamwini if you want to look her up later. Yeah.
So you spoke a lot about visual mediums here, and you mentioned briefly that you weren't going to show text because it was too long. But could you speak maybe a little to how the literary space will be affected by this? Because the literary algorithms are not quite as developed as the visual ones.
Well, recent GPT-2 out of OpenAI is getting pretty good. I don't know. I mean, the problem with literary stuff is the sort of span of things is so great that to produce a great novel is a big question, and we haven't produced a great AI movie either visually. But certainly, I mean, I wanted to show actually some poetry written or read by or created by Alison Parrish from NYU. She uses neural nets to find from a large database, like publicly available database of poetry, to find lines that sound similar, and she stitches them together into really lovely poems where there's a sort of a play of the sound of the speaking. And I just, to actually get enough of it to hear would have taken too long. But Alison Parrish is someone to really look up about computational poetry and use of AI. I personally, obviously, if you look at the giver of names, I'm fascinated. The first thing I ever did with the computer almost was to put a very basic sentence structure in and had it randomly fill that with nouns and verbs and adjectives, and I found that utterly fascinating. And so I'm actually very surprised that I have not ventured into that space myself recently, but it is an area of great interest. However, I want to say something that provokes something that I think is very important. One of the challenges with doing neural network is you need a lot of data, and that creates a certain bias towards using certain kinds of media. There's a lot of sound out there, there's a lot of media out there, there's a lot of text out there and a lot of images out there. But there are not a lot of things about tactility. There are not a lot of things about smell. There are not a lot of things about proprioception, about the way we feel our body. And I think that's a real problem. I think we're making incredible strides in areas where we can gather lots of data, and we're going to have a real challenge really getting in touch with the grounded, embodied aspect of humanity, which has to be part of this conversation. Whereas AI will tilt us way further over than TV did into sort of image, text, sound area. And I'm actually involved with the theater department at U of T, trying to look at AI in applications involving the human body in public space in real time. So that's something I'm really interested in. So that's not addressing your question, but kind of skipping off from your question. Yeah.
So one thing when I saw the Irish artist with doing that made me think back to your very nervous system. It seemed like a slightly modern version of that in some way. So I'm interested. You said a lot about latent space. I wanted to know, from your perspective, how has machine learning or AI evolved in a useful way for artists, and where do you see the next? Where should it evolve? What's missing in it?
Yeah. The first challenge, I think, as I stated, was that there's so much research coming out that it's hard even to get a ground. Like we're learning, and following the research that's coming out, and finding it hard to get our ground and where to start making the art. So if you could slow down the pace of innovation, that would be the first thing that I think, and I think Vector Institute's perfectly placed to help us with that problem. That's right, slow it right down. Slow it right down so we can catch up with it. So that's one area. I think a lot of interesting things are happening with transfer learning now, because it allows artists to, transfer learning is a situation where you use an already trained neural net, but you train it a little bit more on things that are more particular to your interests. So you can take a sort of vanilla trained neural net, so-called, and make it more idiosyncratic and more personal. I think that's an area you're going to see more artists working in. There is also a remarkable tool for anybody who's interested in engaging with neural networks and art practice in any way, a tool that just came out, or is just in beta from the ITP program at NYU called Runway ML. And it's a program that allows you to run very advanced machine learning models on your computer, sort of often via connection to a server machine, but then connect it to other more standard creative tools, like in my case to a program called MaxMSP, or to processing for those who know that area. It makes it easy to integrate really state-of-the-art machine learning things quite easily into the tools that artists use to make their work. And I think that's a really exciting thing. The only thing that I'm concerned about there is that I would not be happy if all artists are using the same 5 neural networks, right? That's not going to be a good thing. So there's a great benefit to making it easier for people to use these in practical ways, but there is a kind of potential normalization, vanillization that's a result of that. So I really hope that some artists will continue to craft their own networks, train their own systems, even though it's very frustrating to do, to keep throwing these sort of oblique darts into the world of machine learning to provoke, or to look at, to see other possibilities.
I think we have time maybe for one more question. Yep.
I have a question for you around creativity. And you talked about going into new domains and getting inspiration from new domains. We saw politics being incorporated in one of those. What about sports? Are there other promising areas that you think could unleash a new wave of creativity?
Just about any domain can unleash. I mean, I think what interests me about this question of domain hopping is that it seems to be an example of creativity that's something that we're uniquely gifted at, because we can kind of coexist in many domains simultaneously. Even if one of them is dominant, a bunch of other domains are sort of active on some level, consciously or unconsciously, as we're engaged in that one thing. And so that's why we are able, when we're lucky, to see, wait a minute, that thing I just saw there would be perfect for this other thing that I didn't really even realize I was thinking about. And I would say, to use sports as an example, anything that takes you then directly into physical activity and the body pushes things to another space altogether. It's even to the degree that I know that if I'm struggling with a really difficult task, a horrible bug on a program, sometimes I will actually define the solution after taking a quick bike ride. I get off the bike, and just as I snap the lock into place, it comes. And it's something about shifting my whole state of operation, my engagement with my body, my activity flowing through the city. It shifts my perspectives enough that I unlock from the problem and find the solution. So anything involving the body, dance, sports, movement, walking, all of these things I think are actually really important to include in our process of engaging in anything, including what seems like a very sedentary, entirely cognitive process. So that's sort of an answer to your question.